Hi, everyone. I'm here with Kyle Morrison. Kyle, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Kyle's an anthropologist who has studied a lot about U.S. conservatism in the last couple of years. Kyle, would you like to kind of walk through maybe what your background is, what your research is, what you're doing now, and how you got into all of this stuff?
Absolutely. So the funny thing is, I come from a very diverse background in anthropology that has absolutely nothing to do with politics until about maybe 4 years ago or so. And I started kind of switch topics in my PhD. I did my bachelor's at Adelphi University on Long Island, and a lot of my focus there was primarily in cultural anthropology, but dabbling a lot in forensics as well, doing field work in Latinx Crete, looking at forensic remains, human remains, and then from there moving actually to go into public archaeology for my master's at the University College of London. So leaving sort of the cultural anthropology field to sort of go into the archaeology field, which is public archaeology being kind of a hybrid approach of public anthropology and tourism and heritage management and archaeology, which I think circled back to once we get where I am now, which is really focusing on not just political anthropology and conservatism, but public anthropology as well, and incorporating anthropological methods into public advocacy work, research work. But I actually came to do my PhD at McMaster University, looking to actually study prisoner of war camps from the Second World War and looking at the post-war migration of former German POWs to Canada. And then COVID-19 hit and the world started to shut down, and I had to sort of pivot. And on a whim, I saw this article in the New York Times about how former Republicans are now leaving the party. And this began to spark this idea of looking at former members of the Republican Party and looking at conservatism and looking at politics in the United States. And that began to evolve into the project that I sort of produced over the next few years.
That's awesome. I mean, I think your start in both forensics anthropology and archaeology is wonderfully different from my background as an anthropologist and what I do as an anthropologist. But it sounds like you kind of got into some similar sets of questions at the end. Can you maybe walk through how did you make the transition into kind of analyzing U.S. politics? But maybe in answering that, if you want to give a quick detour and just describing any listener what public anthropology would mean for anyone that might not be super familiar with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So public anthropology, to start with that, really is inspired by the works of Dr. Robert Borofsky, a professor in the University of Hawaii, or former professor. He's retired now, but his philosophy and approach for anthropology is that a lot of the times we produce work written by academics for academics to be read by academics and studied by the academics, and we don't actually produce work that is read by the people who we are claim to serve, claim to want to work with, and we create this just bubble of that isolates us. And so the idea of public anthropology is you're doing research and work that actually reflects the needs and wants of the communities you work with, and are producing material that's not just a means for academic tenure, but actually accessible means. And a lot of this looks at blogs, podcasts, much more user-friendly methods of community engagement. And this approach that I sort of began to take came about through the methodology that sort of, as I began to work with these individuals, the level of interest and engagement that I think I was seeing coming from individuals who, for the first time, here's a person that wants to sit down and listen to my opinions and views and have a conversation, began to inspire me to realize that I didn't want to write something that was really dense in political theory, that I wanted to write something that was of interest to the people who I'm speaking with, that reflected their views, that reflected their sort of feelings about what was going on, and was a lot more accessible in that nature.
Hmm. Yeah. So what did that look like for you? I mean, I think doing anthropological work that matters, it sounds like that's how I think about public anthropology for what you said. Can you walk us through your dissertation research that you recently got your PhD, and some of the work you did on trying to understand the current political landscape in the United States?
Hello, everyone. This is me, Steven, recording after the conversation. I'm just giving a quick note so you know we happened to do this conversation a couple days before Joe Biden dropped out of the race and Kamala Harris replaced him as the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. So if you're wondering why we talk about Biden, where now it's Kamala Harris, that's why.
Yeah, so my research involves speaking with former members of the Republican Party, I guess these sort of never Trumpers, if you will, people who self-identify maybe as conservatives or moderates or independents that have voted conservative in the past, but we're not going to be voting for Trump in 2020. A few former Trump voters that have shifted, and looking to understand, first off, what does conservative or what did conservative. I'll talk about why I'm distinguishing those two, did and does, in a bit, because that became a really important methodology piece. But looking at how that conservative is being defined, what does that mean to them? What does that mean to their own political identity? And the way I went about doing that was I actually joined a bunch of Facebook groups that were Republicans against Trump, former Trump voters, Democrats, independents for Biden, all these groups that existed on Facebook. And I just posted a recruitment message about me, about my research, asking people to contact me. And over, course of a few weeks, I started getting messages from 20, 30 or so people, and then just started doing interviews and started doing conversations. It was still all on Zoom because of COVID. We were still in lockdown, which actually worked very nicely, both for transcription purposes and that I actually got a spattering of individuals who lived across the country. So it wasn't just one demographic. I spoke with people from Florida, from Arizona, from Pennsylvania, California. So it was a spattering of different population groups, different locations, all different backgrounds. But the thing that brought them together was they did not want to see Trump win, and they were former members of this party that they no longer recognized.
The Republican Party seems to have made some very big shifts especially in the last 8 to 10 years, with candidates like John McCain, who were literally the front runner of the Republican Party to be kind of a deviant outsider within the party at the end of his tenure. In your research, what did you learn about the perspective and experiences of never Trumpers and maybe their take on the Republican Party and U.S. society in general?
Yeah, so the thing I learned, you sort of mentioned John McCain, and he was an example that came up, was that I think I can really summarize a lot of that with the quote that really stood out to me was, I didn't leave the Republican Party left me. And this really sense of feeling that in many ways, in many instances, it was almost this moment of just waking up and realizing, oh my God, what has happened to this party that I once, thought represented ethics and cared for people and was about these principles that I lived my life by. And all of a sudden, I just see it's gone. And this happened in a variable sense of ways, depending on for some, it was sort of a moment of a single moment that just clicked. I think of one person who, he was saying for months he had been defending Trump, and then finally COVID happened, and he just realized that every time Trump opened his mouth, he was calling him stupid. And he just said, I just got tired of being called stupid by the president of the United States. And that was the moment for him where he was just like, I'm done. I don't know why I'm defending this person. But really, there was just still this draw to return to this era where it was about fiscal responsibility. It was about doing what was morally good, upholding scientific evidence, not discounting something basic scientific principles just because you disagreed with something. It was a lot of that was really coming forward and really fueling this drive to see Trump removed, and sort of really pushing these individuals that they were doing whatever they could to bring Biden into the White House and remove Trump from office.
So this makes sense. So it seems like a lot of the people you interviewed, they were in fact Biden supporters. I personally, in my experience with Never Trumpers, have seen some people who will be Biden supporters. Some people will support their party candidates. I've just seen a lot of different individuals navigate this, but I have definitely seen this frustration that you're talking about, or this sense that the party is kind of changed around them. How did you view this, as an anthropologist? Like you were also, with a bit of both their perspective, but also kind of looking more systematically across the landscape. Like, what did you learn about the current U.S. political landscape from all this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think I should clarify. And when I'm saying Biden supporter, I think it does reflect a little bit of what you were just talking about, because one of the things that I was really learning was, and I think anyone who's grew up in the United States, myself included, can relate, is that the U.S. political system is a series of binaries. It's not, you don't look for the ideal candidate. It's very often the feeling of the best of the worst candidate, or I don't like the other person, so I like the other person. And I think that kind of reflected a lot of what people were saying, at least in 2020. And this is going to be interesting when I'm doing some more work now. 2020, Biden, I think, for my interlocutors and the individuals I was talking with, represented normalcy. Biden was, and that's what I think drew him towards it. Biden represented a status quo that they felt had been lost with Trump. And so I think that was what made it. So when I'm saying pro Biden, it was pro status quo, pro normalcy, pro just returning to not waking up and feeling like, oh my God, what crisis is going to be on the news today? What tweet is going to come out that could, jeopardize our political climate? And I think learning about that process and learning, I think it's something that I knew, but I think it really reinforced to me that when you're talking about politics, and also living in Canada now, it's very difficult to explain this to my Canadian friends, is that it's not thinking about it as, well, I like Biden or I like Trump. It's sometimes you're thinking about it as, I don't like that person, so I'm going to vote for this person. And I think that was a big part of it as well. And that, I think, is going to be something that we continue to see in the United States. If we look at the polling numbers, especially for both candidates, people ask me, what do I think is going to happen next election? And I say, I don't know. I think it's going to depend on who dislikes who more and who is motivated to take action based on those feelings more.
Yeah, this makes total sense. I love to hear about it. It seems like a lot of your research involves trying to understand the political perspective of this group. And it seems like, knowing you are not a Never Trumper Republican. You don't ideologically agree with them. And I would love to learn how you kind of juggled that, and juggled that both in your own thinking and research, but also within an anthropological community, which tends not to be super Republican either, let's just say. So that's the first question. I also would love, given what you're saying, to kind of hear what your thoughts are around, you're talking about current research right now that you're doing. And this maybe is related to that, maybe not, but I'd love to hear about how you think this group is approaching the upcoming 2024 election, and to what extent this kind of narrative of a return to normacy is that the current narrative among people in this group, where there's this longing for that this year, or has it shifted?
I actually would say I was honestly pleasantly surprised. I knew that I knew myself, as you said, I'm definitely not a conservative voter. And I knew that I think internally I would have really struggled if I had gone and, for example, studied Trump voters or the far right. And you mentioned about anthropological research as well. You're absolutely right. Ironically, I found that there was almost no anthropological research on what I was doing because there was a lot of anthropological and sociological on the far right, and then a lot of usually by, I would say, sort of left-leaning individuals on studying the far right, or individuals studying sort of niche groups among that we typically stereotypically associate with the far left, but nothing in between. But I think that was actually what really drew me to this and what was important, because the individuals I was speaking with really felt alienated because no one was talking to this group. Now, your question though about sort of how I approached it, I think part of it, and it's very cheesy and ironic kind of just to say it, but I think a lot of it came down to the expression of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And I think what kind of happened was it was this opportunity where two people with different political backgrounds that agreed on one common goal, and that we agreed that this was the goal. We may have disagreed slightly on how we get there, but at the end of the day, we have a commonality and a common goal. And I think that was sort of the overarching theme that I found and was really surprised about. And when I explained this to some of my friends who are same political group I am, I usually say the way I think about it is we're taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but we've still gone 1 step forward. We just haven't gone where we want to get, but we've moved the dial. And I think so. There were moments when I had frustration. We ran into some instances discussing immigration policies, for example, and I had individuals that had very different feelings towards that. Speaking with individuals who coming from very different backgrounds that weren't really bothered by things like Trump's treatment of women, for example, and sort of saying, well, I grew up in a time when that was okay if men treated me like that, and so it doesn't really bother me. And I'm sort of sitting there thinking, as sort of the researcher, not trying to say anything and trying to just maintain kind of a neutral, tell me more about this. But it was definitely a struggle at times and something that I did reflect on and write about. But overall, maybe it's because I was expecting it to be a lot more divisive and a lot more, argumentative. It really wasn't at times. And I was often asked, because of that, do I think that I became more conservative during this research? And I honestly don't know. I might have. I certainly think that I've now become a lot more open to at least hearing someone out of why they believe this or why they see this or why they have this opinion. And a lot of the times then taking this of where can we find common ground? Can we just agree 10% and worry about the other 90% another day? And this was something that actually came up quite a few times. Navigating this disagreement was sort of a fun challenge, if you will, of, almost like a focus group where you sit down and you survey and try and find a common ground and then work from there and try and almost pitch solutions to each other.
I also would love, given what you're saying, to kind of hear what your thoughts are around how you think this group is approaching upcoming 2024 election, and to what extent this kind of narrative of a return to normalcy is that the current narrative among people in this group, where there's this longing for that this year, or has it shifted?
I'll admit I've been trying to follow up with some of them. So this is a lot of this is just speculation, but going off what the conversations I had 2020, 2021, even early 2020, early 2022, I don't see this group going back. I don't know if they will be as motivated to go out and vote and like recruit people to vote for Biden as they were. But there was this very, very strong renouncing of their Republican identity throughout this. And I know at least one of them who I'm friends with on Facebook is still posting how, that the dangers of Trump poses to democracy, and that, the Republican Party is akin to, fascist parties, and very, very, very anti what is the current Republican Party right now. I know that January 6th, that was another major trigger. Anyone who had not renounced their party membership after January 6th, when I spoke to everyone again, had at that point. There was a 3 or 4 people who had still held on to their party at a membership because they said, I want to be able to participate in elections because of the closed and open primary systems that you have to be a part of a certain group. But January 6th was that trigger point where they said that any hope of a normal Republican Party is gone for me, and I'm done. I'm washing my hands of that.
Yeah, this makes total sense. I mean, it seems like the shifts that have happened, that there's a bit of a we're past this mentality from what you're saying. And I wonder to what extent if they're going to vote for on the Democratic side, or if they'll shift over to other people, you have third parties, or not vote, or whatever the case might be in the coming years. I mean, I guess that's a question to be seen, but yeah.
Yeah. My guess or speculation would be, at least going off the conversation we had, a lot of them, I don't think they were fully in the Democratic Party camp. I think a lot of them were very happy now as self-declared independents. But I think it's the vote for a Democratic candidate is the vote against Trump. And I think that's probably how it's remained. Is I'm guessing that I think a lot of them, if there was a viable third party candidate, they would vote third party candidate. But even back in 2020, none of them would vote third party because they knew it would be a throwaway vote. And that comes back to that binary system where there is a desire for them. There was really hoping that a third party candidate would remain, that they'd have another option to vote, but they're forced into picking between one or the other.
In terms of the first part of what you were talking about before, speaking of the binary system, I mean, it seems like politically we live in a pretty polarized time in the United States. I think that the demographics of that, there's a lot of data on that seems to bear that out. But you were talking in the beginning about being more kind of open to listening to people. You were like, did I become more conservative? Probably not, but I at least became more willing to listen. It seemed like you were kind of talking about like a enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of idea of a tactical, well, we have the same goals, let's work together. In my personal experience in the current political landscape, that's not the major perspective. It seems to be a time of much stronger ideological disagreements. What are your thoughts on that? And then how do you think about the kind of social changes that you're interested in, and how do you navigate that, both as a researcher and as a person living in the world?
Yeah, I'll say I found that I agree with you. This is very often groups are rooted in their idea and it is my way or that's it. And I think as I've sort of reflected on my research and I would sort of altered, I think, how I go about having these, I guess, organizing conversations, I do find that I'm sometimes not liked by any party for that reason. On the left, I'm not left enough and I'm willing to compromise. On the right, I'm too left and I, have these ideas that are associated with the evil liberal party, the sort of stereotype. But then somewhere in the middle, there is this group that I think, I don't know if I don't think they're the majority, but I think there's a sizable population, I'm willing to speculate, that is the group that I was speaking with, that is very often quieted or silenced or drowned out by the noise from both sides, because the loudest one's the one that gets the most media attention, and we hear about the ones that are most willing to speak about their views and thoughts. very often, I think, is the two sort of polarized sides. You have your left activists, you have your right activists, the ones that are marching in rallies, the ones that are at events. But then you do have the individuals that just want to have a normal life. And I think that's where this sort of even balance is. Now, I have tried to have these conversations with some of my friends and sort of take this approach, and I've not been as successful as I wish I had been. I've tried again to sort of say, if from a practical standpoint, if we want to pass something through Parliament, or if we want to pass something through the Senate or any sort of governing, you need to have some kind of compromise. You're not going to be able to ram a legislation through very easily if it's just one side. But as you said, there is the desire to do that. And I don't know how we solve that. I really don't, because I think we are, and I think I agree with you. I think it has gotten worse, especially if we look at the US House of Representatives, for example, the Senate, this hard line, our way or we shut everything down, we will burn down the system before we even compromise with the other side, has become the new normal. We saw it starting with Newt Gingrich and the rhetoric that was being used, and weaponizing that. We've seen this evolving into political violence, and I really don't know what the solution is from that. In a utopian world, it would be what I'm pitching here is we go and we have a conversation and we talk about it. But I don't think that will solve it. But that, I think, is where anthropology can come in and begin to have that conversation. It was really beneficial and really great to be able to have this ethnographic and sort of holistic view of a person's life and why they vote that way. Why have they voted in this manner? Why do they act this way? Why do they prioritize certain issues? I've struck a lot of the time by one example I had by someone who for their entire life has grown up in a very rural community in the South, where 90% of the population is a white population, where they only get conservative news. They don't have access to the New York Times. They don't have, CNN. It's Fox News style, small conservative newspapers. And for them, what their sort of awakening of the idea that racism still exists was when they saw George Floyd get murdered on national TV. Up until that point, they sort of felt they were living in a complete bubble because they weren't exposed to that. And being able to talk to someone and sort of get that perspective puts a new light on sort of, before we dismiss someone as saying, oh, you are ignorant, why aren't you supporting this? How could you do that? We need to look at where a person's coming from, because this person's it's hard to judge a person on how they're acting if they literally have not had any exposure to anything else. It's sort of a brainwashing effect. And I think we have that. We have these little bubbles that we live in, and it's becoming easier to break them now with media, but it's still very prevalent.
Yes, this makes total sense, and the various factors that you're talking about make sense. One thing that what you're saying reminds me of, I remember a couple weeks ago, and I'll try to link to it below, but I was watching a podcast from The Atlantic on their YouTube channel, The Atlantic Monthly, about the title was something to the effect of How to Disagree. And it talked about they interviewed, in this case, they actually interviewed a Republican candidate. What they were basically talking about is, how do you have a productive conversation with people who don't agree with you? And one big thing he said the most effective way to convince anybody is to listen to them. That if you actually, people will often try to convince by saying, you're wrong, here's this, here are the facts, here are this. But if you actually want to convince somebody, you need to listen to them. Even if they're saying something that is problematic, or is that you need to kind of hear them out, and that gives them a space to be able to hear your thought. In my personal experience, people listen to you as much as you listen to them. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But also, I love to hear, it seems like to me there's kind of two sides of that there's listening to people helps, even from the perspective of I'm trying to convince them, it's helpful, but it also helps broaden your own horizons and helps you think and helps kind of expand your own thought process to hear other people's perspectives that you might not necessarily understand. So yeah, what are your thoughts on this? And you were talking about, and at least relatedly, it might not seem related, but you were talking about the kind of anthropological tools and ethnography. How might those help in these kind of situations?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that's honestly what attracted the individuals I spoke with to actually speak with me, because I was very transparent up front that I'm not a conservative. And that I think that was really this interesting point. You mentioned that was something that one of the questions you're really eager to hear about was, how did I, as a sort of liberal, speak with the conservatives? And there was the same fascination that I had with my interlocutors was, here's someone who clearly disagrees with me on certain issues, but is actually sitting and listening to me, and I'm listening to them, and we're not attacking each other, and we're not being hostile to each other. And this is such a break from what they've seen and what the sort of norm has become, where, literally I'm speaking with people whose own family members have cut ties with them because of who they voted for. And being able to have a conversation was such a big relief. And I think, as you said, that was sort of the point in which how some of these changing in opinions really began. I did have people who I think over time told me they were becoming more and more and more liberal because of through our conversations we were having. Then on their own, they were doing their own reading and their own research and not being told you're wrong, you're evil, you're this, you're that because of that, but feeling a lot more openness. And actually, that's something that at least one of them told me was the reason why they felt more at home at in the Democratic side, because from the Republican side, at least certainly in 2020, what they found and heard was if you're not 100% with Trump, you are an enemy of Trump. If you're not 100% with the Republican Party, you are against the Republican Party. And for them, they found that the at least part, and that I think this kind of goes to that enemy of my enemy, the kind of common goal was the Democratic Party. By them, they felt that, it's okay if you disagree with us. Are you voting against Trump? Great. Come on in and you're welcome here. And so that was really, I think, that point of having a place where you can talk and listen and disagree, and you're not being talked down to, which is sort of the big difference. So I absolutely agree. I think that's a complete accurate reflection. We talk about actually in political organizing and activism that when you're organizing, when you're doing any of this work, it should be about 90% listening, maybe 10% talking. So it's if you're trying to get someone to, join a membership, or a lot of this is with union organizing, sign a membership card, you're doing only 10% of the talking and you're listening the rest of the time, which is really characteristic of anthropology fieldwork. When you go and you do ethnographic fieldwork and you go and you spend time talking to a population group or interviewing people, you ask a question, a very open-ended question, and then you listen and you just let the conversation flow. And that's what really worked.
Yeah, this makes total sense. In my experience, this is a key part of what cultural anthropology offers with things like ethnography, because ethnography to me is fundamentally about trying to understand and to try to understand what people's experiences are in the cultural context and then process that. So I could definitely see those tools. One question I'm curious about in the current, we'll say, like technology or media landscape, in the current social media world, what might listening look like? What do you think? How would you approach listening? And you were talking before about like bubbles and how the current social media seems to be a very big problem. Kind of encourages bubbles of interaction. Was something you were hinting at before. do you think what do you think listening might look like in the current landscape? And do you think it's possible to, despite its cons, to even use social media to listen?
It's a very good question, and I honestly don't think it is possible. I think by nature, social media is designed to stimulate that part of our brain that we get when we receive attention. They've done studies, and getting that notification gives us that sort of pleasure sensation in our brain. And so the algorithms that social media are designed by, I think, are specifically tailored to our own confirmation bias, to either give us that sort of sensationalism of the articles, you won't believe what happened next, or something that directly agrees with us and our own views. So I don't think we can listen on social media. I think that social media really has created an environment in which the listening doesn't exist, because to participate and to have something be popular, you need to engage in it. You need to reply to something. And if you're replying to something, you're not really listening to it. And so it's built to produce arguments. It's built to produce conflict. And I think as social media has grown, I think that was something that was discussed and said is like what a major contributing factor to this division, that social media is a divisive force.
And it seems like with that, then there's a kind of there's a scale issue. So social media might do this. It might have this kind of divisive, let's pull you, get you roped in, get you to feel strong emotion. It has that impact across millions of people. And talking to people one-on-one, which is one of the major answers that you were talking about, and I agree that's very effective, but that is almost by definition small and local. Like, you can only talk to so many people, right? And you can only talk to people that are around you or that you can interact with. I think one frustration I have is there's a bit of a push in those two different scales. So like one is maybe producing harmful effects in a very large scale, and then solutions almost have to be built like one at a time at a much smaller scale. What are your thoughts?
I think that's one of the challenges with sort of implementing this strategy of finding solutions is, as you said, it requires one-on-one conversation, but that doesn't really work when you have millions of people to talk to. And then if you begin to span it out to something like a social media platform where you're trying to reach millions of people, you lose that one-on-one engagement. So that's where I think you sort of summed it up. I think we're at the crossroads where in order to reach that many people, you need to move away from the strategies that really work and foster engagement, the one-on-one engagement. But if you just focus on one-on-one engagement, you're not going to have a large enough impact to actually make the necessary changes that we need to actually to change, or sort of make the changes we want to see. I think in that sense, the internet has become one of our greatest tools and our greatest, I think, weapons or weaknesses. The internet is fantastic. It allows us to talk to people across the world, but we also have ways now of using it where it really just creates additional division and additional divisiveness, breaks down communication, and the communication we use on social media, I think, has also seeped into our daily rhetoric. It's so easy to be hostile and angry and spout really harmful language if you're posting it from a computer screen halfway across the world. It's a lot difficult to say something like that to someone's face, but then we begin to start to see that the type of sort of, I guess, to use an internet term, trolling rhetoric being used more and more in our everyday lives, as I think we begin to sort of blur the line between the two.
I'm hopeful that that maybe humanity, or at least our society, U.S. society, or U.S. and Canadian society, might be able to help build some solutions over time that are I think, better than the current discourse. But I don't know realistically how that would get implemented. Whether a governments would approve of that, or the corporations would that build the social media platforms would be incentivized to do that. So I'm hopeful, but I have no clue how or why that would happen. But yeah, I guess so. But I agree with you that there's a lot in that can pull people apart, especially when you increase that scale and have less human conversations with people, and lose track of, either consciously or subconsciously, that we're talking to humans and about humans, which is very easy to do on social media. Another question I had for you, it's a bit of a broader question, but you've done this research, you've done this work. What lessons have you learned, and what are the next steps for you in terms of doing this type of work in the future?
Yeah. Lessons I think I've learned is, at least from a research perspective, is keep an open mind of what your topic is and what your question is. As I said, I had to switch topics midway through. I went in with sort of a very broad idea of what I was doing, and then it kind of narrowed down, and I just let the project evolve. The other thing, as I said, I think the big takeaway was a openness and willingness to listen and to speak more with individuals who I disagree with, hear their perspective, and to not be afraid to disagree on topics and to have a conversation about them. And I'd like to begin to apply this to some further organizing work, some campaign work, and then I'll begin to start doing some research pertaining to the upcoming election as well, and see what the future holds for U.S. politics. Because I think we're at a really important crossroad where we could see what I think is a significant crisis to the democratic structures that we've sort of normalized, and are we going to reach a point where we begin to shift away from these?
That makes total sense. I think those are very good open questions right now in the current environment. Yeah, you were talking before about some kind of further research that you were doing. I would love to learn more about that, and I also would love to learn more about some of the advocacy work. You were kind of hinting at it, but like kind of who you've been working for and what you've been doing and what that's looked like.
I'm hoping and planning to begin doing some work almost the identical what I did last 4 years ago. Right now, going and speaking with sort of the same sort of moderate conservative and following up with some of the groups that I've been speaking with. I'd also like to expand this to maybe now include some more sort of the same sort of quote unquote moderate within the I guess the left, try to expand that group a little bit and try to find, what is it that people are looking for in terms of it's something that I think is going to really depend on what happens in the next month or so. Biden does continue on as the Democratic candidate, if he steps down. So keeping a close eye on that will sort of, I think, dictate how that project unfolds, because that's sort of one of the big uncertainties right now. The advocacy work itself, I've been doing a lot of work with the Canadian Union of Public Employees, as well as some other local unions in Canada and the United States, and campaign work. For years, I've worked in a precarious sector as a sessional and adjunct instructor, little to no job security, and we're in a really turbulent time right now, labor-wise, with all the rolling strikes across the U.S. And so a lot of what I'm looking at now and trying to apply these skills is from like a labor organizing perspective. And part of this comes into that many of these organizations have taken very staunch political opinions on certain issues. And of course, there's a large percentage that like this, but then there's a significant percentage that is upset about this. And so trying to take that idea of, let's not worry about that disagreement, let's just worry about something else and find a commonality to stay united and present a united front, is part of what I'm trying to apply in some of my ongoing work right now. Is, let's just talk about a fight that means we both get paid more and have job security, and not worry about any other political stance or position on other political issues or social issues that may or may not be dividing us.
I could definitely see the value of that. I mean, my experience with unions is that they tend to, like, historically sometimes go between extremes of having a big burst of energy and activity and then kind of slowly splintering off into what either particular unions in particular industries or particular groups of workers within the same industry believe in, and kind of going in separate directions, and then getting a bit of a catalyst again and coming together based off of that, and then splintering it off. And it seems like, tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems like from what you're saying, where in Canada it's a bit of a catalyst explosion, and then starting to see some of that splinter off again.
Yeah, we had, the closest thing in Ontario to a general strike in many years, a couple of years ago, and since then we had that boost, and now we're beginning to splinter, where people are upset about the stance that the National has taken on the conflict between Israel and Palestine. And so that's caused a massive conflict where some members are saying we disagree with what the stance of National, some saying we shouldn't even be getting involved in this. This is not something that is a labor issue. Some saying we absolutely need to get involved and we're not getting involved enough. And so no one is agreeing on anything on that standpoint. And so that's where we're beginning to see the splinters of a lot of, the academic locals or the really social advocacy locals that are in it for fights for social issues, LGBTQ2+ rights, the sort of fighting for all of these sort of what we'd say is sort of the more social issues. Then you have your municipal sector that's really just concerned primarily with wages, job security, pensions. And so we're now beginning to see that splinter where it's very difficult to unite each of those sectors. But I still think there's hope there, because especially on a smaller scale, to unite some of this.
Going back to the beginning part of what you were saying before with your research in the U.S. politics, your current research in U.S. politics. I mean, it's a very big coincidence I'm interviewing you during an election year, but it seems like some of the big questions that you were researching before have come back up in the cycle. I mean, it's definitely too early to really know, but do you have a sense for where your current population might be headed in the 2024 election, the current group that you have been researching?
I think that for a majority of these individuals, they will remain in the anti-Trump camp. So voting for anyone who is not Donald Trump. If I'm making a prediction about the US election, I think where we will see splintering is within the Democratic left. And I think we are going to also see a splintering of individuals, not necessarily just the ones I interviewed, but individuals who I'd say would fall within the same camp, shifting back over towards the Trump page. And I think that comes down to sort of the fragile nature of human memory, and that we sort of forget things that happened. And so I think we will start, unless there is a significant change in the Democratic Party, I think we will see a sizable shift away from Biden back to Trump, even amongst sort of the population that I spoke with. But I'm fairly confident the individuals that I interviewed at least will not be voting Republican. I could be wrong, though. I may have a conversation with one or two of them and come back and say, yeah, one of them is planning to switch back. But you'll have to check back in with me in a couple months once I've started having these conversations.
That's totally fair. What fragmentation do you see for the Democratic left, and What do you see happening on that side?
Yeah, so I think a lot of that will be, and this may be groups that never voted for Biden in the first place, but I think what you say, if you want to stereotype the far left, the really young activists that say, Biden hasn't done enough on these issues. I refuse to vote for Biden because he hasn't, he still is supporting Israel. He hasn't done enough of that. I think you'll always have that sort of fringe. So I think there's the splintering there. I think there is the group that in 2020, I think was really motivated to go out and vote for Biden because it meant voting against Trump. And I'm worried now the splintering has become between the, calls for him to step down, the concern about his age, that there's not going to be that drive to go out and vote. And so it's not that they'll vote for Trump, but they may just not vote. They may not show up in numbers. I think there's a significant amount of people who will never vote for Trump, but they may just not vote for Biden. And that, I think, is going to be the deciding factor, is how many people show up to vote for Biden or against Trump. I think that's what's going, from my analysis, that's what's going to decide this election, is how badly do people want to see Trump defeated.
Yeah, this makes total sense. I have definitely seen the shift that you're talking about. I mean, I remember in 2020, with things like the pandemic and other things very fresh in people's minds. I remember a lot of the conversation was basically like you were saying before, was let's go back. It's more of a like emotional desire for less chaos, more normalcy, but then also not the chaos of Trump. And then now I will see, and this is on multiple sides, so both the right and the left, I'll see people they'll almost phrase it as a two-sided frustration of, we're frustrated with Trump with this and frustrated with Biden with this, which I think that could lead to what you're saying of many people, typically on the Democratic side, either just not showing up or making some kind of pivot. But I guess time will tell. That's definitely, I think, what's going to happen is definitely a key part of the election, because we can't always know, and we sometimes just have to wait. But yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk now. It's been really cool hearing about your work, and both your research and also your advocacy work. And I do think you're right. I think that we should try to figure out how to listen. And I'm glad that you have been able to incorporate that into your work. We'll say, despite the current landscape that seems to discourage that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And thank you for having me. It's really nice to be able to talk about this work. This is exactly sort of the medium that I was hoping that I would be able to speak about my research in something that is very user friendly and very easy to read or listen to. This is exactly, as I said, this is what I think we need in anthropology, is a very, very friendly way to be able to access and talk about these important issues and theories.
Yeah, this is definitely a thing I'll see with academia, is that they'll write interesting things, but sometimes regular people won't understand it. What's the best way? Is there any way for people who do want to learn more about your work, about your research? You have a potential book coming up. I don't know if we can talk about that or not. But how would people best learn more about what you do?
The book, I'm hoping, will come out at some point. I can't really talk much more about that because I don't really know timelines on that.
What's your 1 or 2 sentence version of like what it's about?
1 or 2 sentence version would be the story of the American conservative moderate caught between two alienating political parties, trying to find a home in this polarized environment. Come September, you may be able to, if you search me, you may be able to find me on the SUNY Niagara Community College webpage. I'll be an adjunct there. I'm also, for a little while, I'll be on the McMaster webpage. My contact is there. And I believe I have a LinkedIn account somewhere. I'll admit it's been a while since I actually logged into that. as well. But those are sort of the means. It would be just be Kyle Morrison, or if you reach out to the McMaster anthropology department and ask for Kyle Morrison, anyone there will be able to put you in contact with me as well.
Perfect. We'll try to include some of these links below, and thanks
Yeah.
for taking the time.
All right. It was awesome speaking with you. I look forward to when we chat again.